Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Michelle Dowd. I'm a professor of English at the University of Alabama, and I'm a trustee of the Shakespeare Association of America. And it was my privilege to serve as the chair of the inaugural SAA First Book Award Committee, which seeks to recognize monographs with a significant Shakespeare component published as the first book-length publication by current members of the association. So in 2023, we had 4 outstanding finalists for this award, and we wanted to create an opportunity for SAA members to learn more about these books through a series of short informal conversations with their authors. So today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Urvashi Chakravarty, who is Associate Professor of English at the University of Toronto. Her first book, which was the winner of the SAA First Book Award, is Fictions of Consent, Slavery, Servitude, and Free Service in Early Modern England, and it was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2022. So welcome, Urvashi, and congratulations again.
Thank you so much. It was an immense honour to first of all be amongst these phenomenal group of finalists and then to receive this recognition from the SAA. So it means a very great deal, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about the book.
Absolutely. We look forward to learning a little bit more about it today. So I thought maybe we could just begin really broadly or with a general kind of overview. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe give us kind of an overview of like what the book is about, the central claims that you might want to highlight. And if you want to say something too about what you see as its primary intervention in Shakespeare studies, since that's the focus of this particular word, we'd love to hear about that as well.
Thank you. So the book is really an attempt to think about and situate and take account of early modern England's role in the longer history of racialized slavery. And the book is attending to the sort of everyday sites in early modern England where the ideologies of racialized slavery were seeded, where they took hold, where they were developed and disseminated. And it's a kind of, I think, interesting moment that we're in, because we, of course, have had a long history of receiving the narrative that early modern England was sort of innocent of slavery, that it was a moment that was too pure an air for slaves to breathe in, that it sort of anticipated the development of an organised trade in chattel slavery. And of course that it was a service society, so everyone was a servant in early modern England, but service was sort of fundamentally incompatible with, in fact, sort of the antithesis of slavery. So when I began the project, I was sort of confronting what I thought I understood about this moment, which is that there A, was no slavery, and B, that it was a moment that was sort of innocent of slavery. And of course, that was also informed by the longer genealogy of fictions around British slavery, which are really founded on the idea that Britain was exceptional, that it abolished slavery first, that it never had slavery on its shores. So that was sort of the long history of British exceptionalism, which I think we also often read back into early modern England. And what this book tries to do instead is, in fact, it argues that the structures and the ideologies of Atlantic slavery were sort of rooted in the everyday context of English service, of the family, of the household, the classroom, and the theatre. And so it's really making a case for the fact that we need to hold not just early modern English culture, but also the texts we read from the time, including all of Shakespeare's works, to account for the conceptual architecture that it would then go on to generate. So to give a couple of examples, when it comes to the classroom, for instance, I look at the reception of Roman slave plays in early modern England in the humanist classroom. And I argue that it's precisely these classical slave plays that would then go on to inform and in fact generate early modern ideas of race and slavery, and that it was in particular the Roman idea of the macula servitutis, or the stain of slavery, that was sort of figurative in classical context, but would then become somatically marked and would become a kind of heritable stain of slavery in the early modern context. When I look at the family in early modern England, I think about the fact that even in the word family, we get a kind of lexical association with the famulus, or the Roman household slave. So written within the family is this sort of etymological link to slavery, but it's also a structure in early modern England that's sort of navigating its links to both service on the one hand and blood on the other. And it's precisely through those negotiations that we get kind of connection to its futures of heritable and blood-based descent. And then I also think about, for instance, the sort of everyday contracts of apprenticeship and indenture, and how the kinds of contingencies or fictions of consent, as I call them, within those contracts are precisely what lead to the ideologies, but also the kind of rhetorical frameworks of bound labour. So what I hope readers will take away, particularly in Shakespeare studies, is both the sort of everyday connections that early modern English cultural texts and sites had to the development of racialized slavery, but also the fact that even in our reception of Shakespeare, we need to think about how sort of everyday economy of service was very much complicit in these larger economies. And of course, Shakespeare himself was sort of adapting Roman slave plays, like so many others. But I think we also need to confront, as readers, the sort of the long history of British innocence, of exceptionalism around racialized slavery, and sort of think about how early modern English text and early modern English culture was complicit in sort of conceiving of the conceptual architecture that would make it possible.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. It's really, you speak a lot to both, kind of methodology as well, right, as the scope of the text, and kind of confronting a kind of historical, like a received truth that we need to question, right? One of the things that your discussion there does give us a sense of, right, is the range of kinds of materials, right, you talk about in this project. So obviously you talk about Shakespeare and theater, but you talk about the grammar school classroom and, apprentice indentures and other kind of legal documents. And so that's one of, I think, the features of the book that's quite impressive, notable, is that range. And so, maybe as a sort of slicing into that, I mean, if you could, you already alluded to some examples already, which are so helpful, but is there a chapter, or maybe even like part of a chapter, like a specific example that you want to draw attention to, that kind of crystallizes, what you see as some of those kind of those arguments you were making in the entire book? Is there an example that you can point us to kind of make it even, more vivid for us in the moment?
Yes, of course. I think one of my favorite examples is from chapter 2, and I'm personally quite fond of this image, because I remember I still have a very sort of vivid memory of stumbling across this image in the archives and feeling really, really excited, and that excitement sort of lasted through the process of writing the book itself. And it's a moment where I look at an image of Ethiopsa, or the Ethiopian maid, a character from Terence's play The Eunuch, and it's an image in a 15th century Latin edition of Terence. And what's striking to me about the image is that a reader has actually inked in her face. And so for me, that was a really striking moment, and one that really helped me crystallize one of the arguments of the book, because first of all, I think the image points to the widespread reception of Roman slavery and how significant, how central it was to early modern ideas of enslavement, but also to race, because of course what I think we see in this moment is literally the inscription of what I've called the stain of slavery, the sort of figurative stain of slavery from the Roman context into an epidermal and a legible stain onto the face of Ethiopia. So here is a moment where we, I think, see the inscription of the stain of slavery in a contemporary moment onto a Roman context. And the reason I think this is so significant is that we obviously have a significant amount of early modern material, early modern discussion of English and European experiences of captivity and slavery in the Mediterranean, but those, I think, are predicated on the idea that one can move into and out of slavery. What I argue is happening at this moment is the sort of overwriting of the stain as something that's epidermal, as something that's somatic, something that's immutable, and also as I go on to discuss, heritable onto the bodies of some, but not others. So for white, English or European captives, they are not marked by the stain of slavery. They can be redeemed into and out of enslavement, but for others, they can't. And I argue that this becomes, I think, really important in a play like Othello, where Othello has been redeemed from slavery. But one of my suggestions is that for someone like him, that redemption is much more contingent. So we also start to see how the structures of racialized slavery start to sort of become not just rhetorically or conceptually encoded, but also sort of disseminated in this sort of very small quotidian moment of pedagogy. And for me, it was a really central moment, because of course it, as I said, marked this inscription, but it also marked the site of this understanding as a kind of everyday site, the humanist classroom, someone just sort of doodling on a page. And it shows a kind of cultural force of this work. And I think in a larger context too, what we see happening at this time is an attempt to understand where and how markers of bondage can be read. So in another moment in the book, I think about livery, the sort of everyday, the everyday clothing of service. And obviously there are lots of moments and conversations about whether it marks servitude, whether it marks service. But ultimately what I argue about livery is that it's an attempt to read the body markers of bondage, and it purports to teach people how to do so. So even in the context of the theatre, where that's being negotiated in the context of service more broadly, what we see is the kind of the ways in which early modern readers, audiences, servants, are all navigating what it means to read the body for bondage.
No, that's fascinating. And your examples there pull together, the richness of like the archival finding, and then that everyday sort of pedagogical moment with, our reading of, obviously a play like Othello that, people might expect in a discussion like this, but it brings together those materials in such surprising, I think, and illuminating ways. So thank you for that example. I think that helps give people a sense of the complexity of your arguments, and also the kind of richness of those moving between these different sites, I think, these cultural and literary sites. Yeah. And so maybe this is a little bit of a jump, but I'm thinking, obviously you alluded there to working in the archive. You obviously have, this range of materials you're working with. And, this is really a question sort of about more like process, I guess, and your method. Writing projects or writing book projects especially is hard work, obviously, as you know, and it's time consuming. And, I imagine there might be a lot of people listening to this who are working on projects, maybe book projects, trying to get started with some projects. And I'm just wondering if you could share with us something about the process for you in terms of maybe something that, helped you, complete it, or was either, sort of structurally something that was useful for you, or a practice, or an opportunity, or anything that you might want to share with us about, how you were able to bring this project to completion, which is obviously, over many years, right? Just some insight into that, I think would be really great to hear from you.
Thank you. I love that question, and I'm always really interested to hear what has worked for other people as well, because I think it can be a really isolated and isolating experience. Obviously, when one's writing one's first book, in particular, I think. And one of the things I'm incredibly grateful for are the kinds of research communities that I was lucky enough to have access to. So some of that was through these kinds of archival contexts. So I was fortunate enough to be able to spend a year at the Huntington, sort of at the archives. And so that was sort of this wonderful blend of spending time in the reading room and sort of really kind of luxuriating in the material and hoping for the accident of the archive. But the other part of that was having the opportunity to sort of think with and learn from a group of scholars at all career stages and across disciplines too. So I think that kind of interdisciplinary conversation was really important. The other side of that, to sort of add a more personal note, is that I was fortunate enough to be in a situation where my partner was with my dog on the other side of the country, and it was, a sort of challenging financial setup, but it required that kind of support. So I've been really excited to see organisations and institutions that both provide that kind of support, as the SAA does, for instance, for those archival opportunities. But also that are thinking more capaciously about what it means to do that kind of research, whether that's through remote fellowships for people who caring responsibilities or financial contingencies, as resided at the time. So that's one thing. The other thing, and it's a kind of extension of that, I really benefited from the kinds of research communities, particularly research and scholarly communities of scholars of colour, that I was, again, fortunate enough to have access to. I'm thinking in particular of a year-long Volta seminar that I was in on race and gender, for instance, and the opportunity to both share my work, to receive feedback on it, but also to sort of think with a group of people over the course of the year. And I think particularly the kinds of structures and support that provides is incomparable. But it also, I think, is really useful in sort of providing the opportunity to have a conversation about how one moves from manuscript to published product, right? The opportunity to speak with people who can demystify the process for one, the opportunity to sort of think with people who are willing to say, you might want to try this press or that press or the other press. That kind of structure and support, I think, is invaluable. And I'm really excited to see structures like the Race First and Second Book Institutes that do sort of provide that kind of scaffolding and provide not just the kind of opportunity for conversation and for collaboration, but also the kinds of nuts and bolts on how to move from A to B, because that was one of the things I found most confusing when I was working on the book. How does one get this thing published? So it's been really wonderful to see those sort of opportunities sort of proliferate through the very, very hard work of people on the ground. I've also been incredibly grateful and excited for scholarly communities that are sort of built from the ground up. I'm thinking of things like Race Before Race, but also communities like Emotrans that offer spaces for scholars to come together to think about these huge urgent questions around scholarship, around how to move through the world. And I'm really, really grateful that we're seeing more work, but it does take a tremendous amount of labour, and we are in the debt of the scholars who are making these communities possible.
Oh yeah, well that's really illuminating, and that's a generous, I think, account too of the range of structures that are out there, both personal and institutional, but also kind of that in between, which is kind of institutional in a way. It's through academic communities, but as you say, through the grounds up more than through already well-established means, but that kind of more informal network of support that is so important, I think, to all of us. I'll speak for myself as well, but and I think it's great to highlight those different levels, I think, of ways in which we build together as a community, including interdisciplinary. I think that is important, as you mentioned earlier. So I guess we'll come back now, kind of full circle to returning to your work, but sort of thinking. So it's sort of two different questions here, but as a way of kind of concluding our discussion. But is you've finished this project, obviously, and I'm just curious about what you're working on now, or if you have thoughts about the next directions that you'd like to take your own research. And if you'd like to, I'd also be interested in sort of a comparable thought you might have about the directions of the field of Shakespeare studies. Like, do you see what do you see as next, or as next in terms of importance for Shakespeare scholars to take on? So either or both of those, if you want to address them, I'd love to hear from you on that.
Thank you. And I'd be really interested to hear from others and speak to others about this too. So the book that I'm currently writing is about racial futurity in early modern England, and it's attending to the nexus of race and reproduction in the larger Atlantic world, and it's specifically thinking about the construction of white womanhood as a sort of racialized and gendered strategy towards the larger sort of imperial project, as I put it, of racial futurity. So what's been interesting about this, of course, is sort of working on a project about racial futurity during a summer of what feels very much like climate catastrophe. I mean, in Canada, we've had the fires, which I know have been affecting people in the US as well. And so I've been thinking about and sort of learning from the work of sort of wonderful people thinking about the nexus of race and eco-criticism. And I'm really excited to see where those conversations go in the future. The book, as I mentioned, is about the construction of white womanhood, again, as a strategy rather than a kind of object. And so I've been really sort of excited by and grateful for the work of those who are thinking, again, at the intersection of trans studies and critical race studies. And thinking about how our largest categories of gender, of race, of embodiment are sort of constructed and have sort of already been deeply contingent. I think one sort of abiding interest that I'm still grappling with and thinking through is a question around how do we think about labour, how do we think about these larger structures of race and class? And I think it's a live question for me when we think about the future of the field or directions in the field. The assault on the humanities more broadly, but also the sort of what has felt like a kind of deliberate defunding of and sort of economic contingency around our discipline. And so one of the questions that I've been thinking a lot about, and it's an open question for me, is how do we as a field, as a field of Shakespeare studies, also think about protections for the most precarious amongst us? How do we think about these larger questions of labour and class as they pertain to the most disenfranchised amongst those of us who are doing this work? And that's sort of a scholarly question, but it's also a question about practice, and it's a question that I'm currently grappling with, and I very much hope to have further conversations about this as a field and as an association.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And I think we raise really important issues there, both for the sort of practice of our field, as well as the subjects that we study, right? And what that work is going to look like going forward, that I think we can't separate those two things out, the discipline of our field from the research and work we're doing have to be thought about, I think, together, as you're suggesting there. It's exciting. The project, your future work sounds amazing and really fascinating. We can't wait to hear more about that in the future. So thank you so much, Urvashi, for taking the time to speak with me today. And, congratulations again. And this was a great conversation.
Thank you so much.